Jesus was a political prisoner. We don't know whether or not he was morally perfect. We like to think so because people didn't write about him until hundreds of years afterwards.
All right.
So
Let's
to
deal with
follow
that
him, we have to take out all of his faults.
Okay.
So he was nothing more than a political prisoner.
All right. Now, maybe you're right. Here's the reason why I believe he did live a perfect life. In John chapter 8, Jesus looked into the faces of his enemies. And he says to his enemies, which one of you can prove me guilty of sin? And his enemies are silent. Well, if your enemies can't point out a sin in your life, that's kind of solid evidence that you're living a pretty good life.
But if they can't point out a fault against you, why would they be your enemy in the first place? And again, this wasn't written until hundreds of years afterwards, so how do we even know that happened?
Oh, no. The Gospels are written in the first century. The way we know that is because in 96 AD, Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, Clement, Bishop of Rome, wrote letters. And in those letters, they quote Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So we know that Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written in the first century because they're quoted in letters written by the early church fathers.
Well, forgery was also a big tenet back in the day. The donation to Constantine, when he split Rome and went to Constantinople, he left the Bishop of Rome a little piece of paper that says, you're basically in charge. Well, the Catholic Church doesn't want really to get out, but they found it such that the Bishop of Rome forged that himself. So there are many instances, and that's a big one because basically that says that the foundation, the cornerstone of the Catholic Church is a forgery. That forgery was a big thing back then. So how do you know that any of this is to be taken?
Please do not
literally?
Put your faith in Constantine. Please do not put your faith in an institution called the church. Rather, look at Jesus Christ. Examine the evidence of his reliability and then put your faith in Jesus Christ, not in an institution called Christianity.
But his reliability is based on everyone else's reliability. Everyone who said everything about him. He never put down anything in paper himself, but everything that we know about him, everything that we have to believe about him, comes from what other people have written. And over the ages, we're not the first ones to figure out that religion can be used to use people and to control them. The people who wrote the Bible probably also realized the same thing, because how do you think the pharaohs are able to get thousands of people to build him a pyramid and have thousands of people die for him?
All right.
By saying they're an extension of God.
Sir, the abuse of a fact does not change the fact. The abuse of a fact does not change the fact.
Which fact am I
The
using?
abuse of Jesus Christ by, quote, Christians, unquote, does not change the fact that Jesus lived a sinless life, taught amazingly fine ethical teachings, died a sacrificial death, and then rose from the dead. The abuse of a fact, and you're right, Christianity has done some horrible things, but the abuse of a fact does not change the fact. And the historical facts are, Christ lived a sinless life, he taught amazing ethical teachings, he died on a cross, forgiving and loving his enemies, and 3 days after he died, he rose from the dead. As Lincoln put it, you can't change history. That's history. Now, it's also history that Christians fought the Crusades, did the Inquisition. It's also a historical fact that white Christians enslaved African Americans. Those are historical facts. But I can promise you, my African American sister here has had the academic, intellectual objectivity to not allow a white Christian racist to turn her off to the true Jesus Christ. No, I listen to you. Now, you please listen to me, okay?
Sorry.
My African American sister has had the intellectual objectivity to not use a white Christian racist to reject Christ. She's had the intellectual objectivity to look at the historical facts of who is Jesus. How did he treat different racist attitudes? And when you read the New Testament, you'll see that in Christ's first sermon in Luke chapter 4, he makes a direct frontal attack on racism, almost loses his life for it. And then in his best-known parable, in Luke chapter 10, the parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus makes a direct frontal attack on racism in the parable of the Good Samaritan. So you don't need to be a PhD in New Testament to know Jesus didn't have a racist bone in his body, which means when white Christian racists go out and oppress African Americans, that's not in obedience to Jesus. That's in disobedience to Jesus. And you better not be so close-minded that you reject Jesus Christ because of some white Christian racist.
But what did Jesus say about slavery? Slavery itself, not racism, because the Romans were kind of racist against Jews and vice versa because the Jews were giving the Romans such a hard time. So racism was around back then, and he said, this sucks. But what did he say about slavery itself?
We don't have a record of Jesus saying anything about slavery.
One thing. The slave should be good to the master, and the master should be good to the slave.
Yes,
he
Paul wrote
advocated
that.
slavery.
Paul wrote that. Yeah, you got
So
to read
Jesus
in
advocated
context.
slavery, though.
You got to read in context. Paul wrote those words. And Paul also wrote to Philemon, a slave owner, that you are to accept Onesimus, your runaway slave, back no longer as a slave, but as a brother in Christ. So what's obvious is Paul did not call for a slave revolt in the Roman Empire. Instead, he called slaves to put their faith in Christ. He called masters to put their faith in Christ. But then he laid the foundation for the abolition of slavery, pointing out to masters, your slaves are brothers in Christ. Free them. That's the point of Philemon.
So isn't that then, in a way, disavowing slavery? Paul's saying that, but Jesus isn't.
Jesus never talks about slavery.
Why
Paul
not?
did.
If slavery is such a big problem, why didn't he say anything about it?
Well, Jesus didn't talk about battered wives and abused children.
They were around then, too.
Yeah, they sure were.
Even worse now. Or even
But
worse then
obviously,
than now.
Jesus lays the foundation for understanding that to batter your wife and to abuse your child is evil. And obviously, Jesus lays the foundation for slavery being evil. Because Jesus points out that all human beings are created in the image of God, and God don't make junk. He makes human beings with innate value and worth and significance.